What if I told you there was a frequency that our ears were not meant to hear? It's the right height, not too high or too low, a sound that doesn't fit here, a signal that changes you in a small way that you don't notice at first until it's too late. Quick question before we start. Do you have headphones on right now? If so, get one out just for this story. Believe me, what is the weirdest sound you can think of? You've ever heard but didn't understand. How did what I'm about to say begin? It began with a sound that no one should have heard and ended with something much worse. The plains began to break and crack into ridges and coulees in the northeast corner of Wyoming in October 1938, just before they crossed into Montana. A piece of land is so dry and empty that even the farmers who owned the land around it wouldn't let their cattle graze there. It wasn't because the grass was bad. The grass looked good. The sheep just wouldn't move. They would walk to the property line, stop, and then go back. Every time it was like the ground on the other side smelled like something they knew better than anyone else. People who lived there called it Dry Ridge Valley. In the sense of a picture, it's not a valley. There are no green hills or rivers at the bottom. The long, shallow depression was between two parallel hills of pale sandstone. It was about 2 miles wide and 8 miles long, going from north to south. The valley floor was made up of hard-packed alkali flats that were as white as bone and cracked into patterns that looked like the skin of something very old and dry. Sage spots that were so gray and broken they looked like they were fossils were the only plants that grew there. The hills on either side were not very high, about 300 feet, but they were straight and sharp, like walls. The wind did something strange between those walls. It didn't go through. It went in a loop, but the ridges on either side stopped it. The wind would come in from the north and have. We can only go south. After that, it would hit the southern hill and come back up. It would keep going back and forth, building on top of itself until the air inside the valley was buzzing at a rate that you could feel in your teeth. This was known by the farmers. It was known as the hum. The main character in this story was a 36-year-old radio operator for the U.S. Weather Bureau called Virgil Trusclair. He had been moved from a coastal job in Louisiana to a remote monitoring station, at the top of Dry Ridge Valley in the north. The station was called WBX-14 and had a tin roof on a single concrete blockhouse, a generator shed, a 60-foot radio antenna, and a wind gauge that never stopped turning. A 23-mile dirt road went to the next town, which was called Keir. The last phone I could reach was in Keir. Most days, the person who was closest to me was also in Keir. Virgil was short and strong, like a fence post. He had a red neck that was always peeling, small dark eyes set deep in a broad face, and hands that were like a tree trunk. Those felt surprisingly soft for a man his size. He was good with tools. Just like a musician tunes a piano by feel, he could tune a radio by hearing what wasn't there as well as what was. During the war, he was a radio operator on a warship in the Pacific. The Wyoming plains' silence fit him in a way he couldn't quite explain. After years of ocean noise and engines that were always shaking, the dry, quiet valley felt like medicine. He had an easy job to do. Keep an eye on the weather and write down every 6 hours the air pressure, wind speed, temperature, and amount of rain or snow. Send readings to the office in Cheyenne via shortwave radio. Keep an eye out for storms, boring work, and long stretches of nothing followed by short, effective broadcasts. It didn't bother Virgil. He liked being alone more than talking to other people and did not like being surprised. The only regular person he saw was a rancher called Collis Dobney, who drove a supply truck that came every 2 weeks. Collis was 62 years old, had a face like wrinkly leather, and a voice that sounded like he'd been gargling sand since birth. He spoke in short, declarative sentences and looked out over the valley with the flat, unflinching tiredness of someone who had lived their whole life near something they didn't understand but had come to terms with. They weren't really friends, but they were like men who see each other regularly and don't expect anything else from each other. When Virgil was on duty at midnight on October 11th, 1938, he picked up a signal he had never heard before. He was drinking coffee that had gone cold an hour ago while sitting in the metal folding chair that had made itself fit his body over the months he had been stationed here. He was only half listening to the steady wash of atmospheric static. As usual, the wind outside was going around the valley in long, slow loops that made the antenna buzz and the tin roof drip. His logbook had a new page. It was 12:07 on the wall clock. There wasn't a big change in the static. It was more like the difference between white and brown sand. But Virgil had trained his ears to pick up on things like this. The frequency range had been filled with something that wasn't static, noise, or a normal signal. He put his hand on the dial and started to look. Based on his technical instructions, it should not have been carrying anything when it came in on that frequency. A dead zone. There was a space between the given bands where nothing was meant to send. There is empty room on the dial that is necessary, structural, and basically empty. That being said, something was sending. The sign stayed the same. Not speech, not Morse code, and not static. There was only one tone that went up and down slowly over the course of about 90 seconds, making the sound slightly change. Someone pulling a bow across a single cello string made it sound like that, but the note was off. It's not straight or flat, and it's wrong in a way that Virgil, who had spent years listening to radio signals in all kinds of weather, had never heard of. It hurt his teeth. That was the only way he could explain it. There was a physical feeling in his jaw from the sound. It seemed to go right through his ears and into the bone. It wasn't painful. It felt close, like the signal was getting to something inside him that it shouldn't have been able to. He wrote it down. Time, frequency, length, and characteristics. He said that the signal seemed to be coming from further south in the valley, but his equipment wasn't accurate enough to give a specific direction. It went on for 47 minutes before it stopped. It stopped, not faded. It sounds clean and sudden, like a switch being turned on and off. The next morning, he sent a message to the office in Cheyenne, an odd sound on a frequency that hasn't been assigned. After 12 hours, the answer came. As usual, it's most likely an atmosphere skip or an ionospheric bounce. Keep an eye on it and let us know if it happens again. It kept happening every night. It felt the same in his jaw every time, the same time, frequency, tone, and 90-second pattern. 47 nights in a row, for 47 minutes each. It changed on the 8th night. The tone broke. One note turned into two, combining in a way that Virgil's trained ear knew was wrong because it wasn't a normal musical interval. There was an empty place between the notes where the two tones should not have been, and the dissonance they created wasn't bad. It pulled you in. Virgil. Without meaning to, he found himself leaning closer to the receiver. Like a plant moving toward light, his body moved towards the sound. He stopped when his face was just inches from the speaker and jumped back in shock. He wrote this down in his log. A signal causes a physical reaction that can't be stopped, and there may be an infrasound component. He tried to be as scientific as possible about it. That was the first mistake he made. I have a question for you. When you heard a sound, it made you feel something you couldn't put your finger on. Not really a feeling, more of a state. I like the sound, changed how something works inside you. Moved some furniture around in a room you didn't know you had. That's what Virgil had to deal with. Enter it in the box below. Then a third tone, and then a fourth one, showed up on the 9th night. Each one separated from the last and added to the chord, making it thicker and more complicated. By the end of that night's window, the signal had at least 12 different tones stacked in a way that made it clear that it was structured. It wasn't background noise. Something was. Planning to broadcast from somewhere in Dry Ridge Valley, and the show was changing. It was a long report that Virgil sent to Cheyenne. Frequency readings, duration data, and his thoughts on how the body responded. He asked for a technician and tools for triangulation. It took 3 days to answer. The Cheyenne monitoring station did not pick up any strange signals on the mentioned frequency. An inspection of the equipment is planned for the next open date. Follow standard procedures. They did not hear it. 200 meters away and better. Tools and equipment. They didn't get it. That meant it was a nearby signal. Very close by, coming from inside the valley itself. Not too close to reach anyone else, but close enough to reach his antenna. When Collis brought supplies on October 23rd, Virgil asked him about the signal and told him about the sound, the frequency, and the time. While emptying fuel cans and food cans, Callis listened. His worn-out face didn't say anything. Callis sat down on the box Virgil was in when he was done, carrying, and turned to look at him. He asked, "You're hearing the hum?" Virgil asked what he meant when he said, "Not a question." Collis rolled a cigarette while leaning against the truck. He lit it slowly and smoked half of it before he spoke. In the 1880s, my grandfather ran cattle on the East Ridge. He told my grandfather about the hum, and my grandfather told me that it goes back further than that. The Crow people who lived in this area before the settlers gave this valley a name, which my grandfather learned. From an old Crow man he traded horses with. The name meant something like the valley that listens. He took another drag. The ridges do something to the wind. They catch it, bounce it, and stack it on top of itself until the air inside the valley is vibrating at a frequency that isn't wind anymore. It's something else that the valley makes on its own. Most of the time, you can't hear it. It's just a feeling in your chest and a buzzing in your jaw. The cattle can feel it, which is why they won't graze. There is a hum in the valley, and the birds can feel it. Virgil had noticed this. But sometimes, Collis said, when the conditions are right, when the air is dry, the wind is steady, and the temperature drops just so. The hum rises, it breaks through into a range you can hear, or your radio can hear, and once you start paying attention to it, it does something to people. What does it do? Collis looked out over the valley. The alkali flat opened up in front of him. It was white and empty in the October sun, with ridges rising on either side like the walls of a trough. Heat shimmer made the southern end look like water, but it wasn't. "It takes things from you," he said. "At first, it's small things, like the name of someone you used to know, or a word you've used 1,000 times, or the color of your mom's front door. Broke into your house while you slept, and took one small thing from each room. At first, you wouldn't notice because it wasn't important, but over time, the rooms start to feel empty." He dropped the cigarette and stomped on it. In 1911, a tough man named Alcide Perardi set up camp in the valley. He knew this land better than anyone else alive, and had a big shepherd mix named Drum that he took with him everywhere. Alcide walked into the valley. 2 hours later, Drum came back alone, whining and running flat out with his tail between his legs. He wouldn't stop running until he reached the top of the ridge, and he never went back to the valley. Alcide stayed for 3 weeks. Sepilia Coos stopped. The wind moved across the flats slowly and steadily, making a thin layer of white dust that drifted like smoke. When Alcide walked into Kier, he couldn't remember his own name, what language he spoke, or who he was. When his wife ran up to him in the street and grabbed him, he looked at her like you would at a stranger who grabs your arm, confused and a little scared. She took him home and sat him down in his chair. He stayed there for the next 11 years, 11 years of his life. He never said a word. His wife would talk to him, read to him, play music for him, but he just stared at the wall, the sky, or his hands, turning them over and over like he had never seen them before. His wife told him that he would sit up at exactly midnight and tilt his head to one side as if he were listening to something. He would stay focused, not scared or confused, like a man trying to memorize a piece of music for exactly 47 minutes. Then he would lay back down every night for 11 years. 47 minutes was the exact length of the signal. Virgil's realization hit him like a ton of bricks. Collis looked at him and said, "Turn the dial. Don't listen to it. Don't deal with it. Let the valley hum on its own. It has done this for a long time, even before people came here. It will do it again when we're not there. It doesn't need anyone to watch it." Collis got back in his truck and said one more thing out the window before pulling away. "The valley doesn't hate people," the crowman told my grandfather. "Doesn't mean to hurt them. It's never changed what it does. The same way a river doesn't dislike a stone it breaks down. In the same way, the wind doesn't dislike the sand it blows away. The valley is aware. That's how it works. It holds on to what it hears. It holds on to the sound like a picture would. And after a while, if you stay in the valley long enough, it will sound like you more than you sound like you. After that, you're no longer someone who listens to the valley. You live in the valley that used to. Be a person." He left. A long time passed before the dust from his truck fell to the ground. As Virgil stood outside the station and watched it move, he thought about what Callis had said. "There is more of you in that than there is in you," she said. As he looked south down the valley, he saw the white alkali flats that stretched into heat shimmer and the ridges that stood on either side like the walls of something that was built on purpose. It was now that he felt something other than fear. Recognition. The valley was. And Virgil, with his trained ears and shortwave radio, had been putting in 47 minutes of careful, methodical listening every night. That night, the signal was stronger than it had ever been. Now, this is where I need to be honest. This is where a smart man would have listened to Collis, turned the dial, turned in a final report, and spent his nights reading books But Virgil Trosclair wasn't smart. He was curious. And in Dry Ridge Valley in 1938, he was curious. He was alone in a concrete box between two ridges that had been shaping wind into something that shouldn't exist for 65 million years. Curiosity was the most dangerous thing a man could have. And while we're here, this story comes to you from the fear behind you. If you're still with me, hit that subscribe button. It helps us more than you know. Now, let's go back to the valley. Virgil didn't turn the dial. Instead, he started to map the signal. Every night for 2 weeks, he wrote down everything. Frequency, duration, number of tones, intervals. He filled a whole notebook with data, graphs, and hand-drawn wave patterns. And he noticed patterns. The tones repeated in cycles a 12-tone sequence over the course of a week, then reset each cycle slightly different. The intervals moving. The overall pattern. He tapped his pencil 3 times on the desk while taking notes on November 2nd. It was a habit, and it didn't mean anything, but the signal stopped. For exactly the length of his 3 taps, the tone stayed steady, as if listening. Then it started up again. He tested it by tapping twice, then tapping 5 times, then clapping his hands 5 times. The signal stuttered, broke up into pieces, and then came back together in a different way. The signal knew he was there. The realization came to him slowly, like how frost settles on a window in patterns, first the edges and then the middle. He sat in his chair and stared at the receiver. It was then that he realized something in Dry Ridge Valley was listening to him through the static the same way he was. That something had been listening for longer. It had been listening to the wind, the dust, and the footsteps of every animal that had ever crossed the alkali flats. It had been learning and growing and waiting for something that could listen back, and now it had one. He told himself this was science. He told himself he was collecting data. He told himself that understanding the signal was the first step toward explaining it. He told himself many things during the trip. He was lying to himself because he knew that even back then, tapping on his desk and hearing something impossibly old tap back wasn't science. It was seduction. The signal was pulling him in like a whirlpool pulls a leaf not violently, but with the simple, irresistible logic of a current that has nowhere else to go. He started tapping in patterns and simple sequences. It took Virgil's simple inputs and made them part of its structure, like a master weaver adding a new thread to a tapestry. After a week, the nightly broadcast had turned into a conversation, with Virgil's simple inputs and the signal's complex tones building on what the other gave them to make something that neither could have made on their own. And the conversation was speeding up, with the signal responding faster each night, anticipating his inputs. It was learning him by mapping his rhythms based on how he had mapped its frequencies. It was creating a sound-based mirror image of his mind, and with each session, the image was more accurate. On November 7th, the signal did something that stopped his pencil. It tapped back his pattern before he tapped it. He was about to tap a sequence he had planned in his head. 4,241. He hadn't moved, hadn't touched the pencil. 4 tones, a pause, 2 tones, a pause, 4 tones, a pause, and 1 tone. That was his exact thought. He wrote in his log, "It is not reading the taps. It is reading me," and Virgil was changing. At first, he didn't notice. On November 8th, he forgot to take his 6 a.m. reading for the first time ever. On November 9th, he forgot to eat dinner. On November 10th, he looked in his shaving mirror and didn't recognize himself for 3 seconds. Not because he looked different, but because the idea of his. On November 12th, he realized he couldn't remember his mother's name not just off the top of his tongue. Anywhere, it was gone, leaving the space around it empty. Collis' words came back to him. They start forgetting things, little pieces falling away. Over the next few days, Virgil forgot his middle name, his date of birth, the name of the ship he'd served on, the town where he grew up, the taste of coffee, what the word Thursday meant, and how to tell one thing from another. It was like surgery. One minute he knew something, the next it was gone, leaving a smooth blankness like a wall where a painting used to hang. He wrote down everything and kept a list of what was missing, adding to it every morning as he found new things missing. The list itself was proof that he still existed. As long as he could remember what he'd lost, he hadn't lost everything. November 10th. He looked at the generator and couldn't remember what fuel it used. His hands knew the answer. He stared at the gas can for 11 minutes before his body, using a memory deeper than his mind, finished the task without him. November 11th. He forgot how to tie his shoes and stared at the laces for 20 minutes. Eventually, his fingers did it on their own, using muscle memory, while his conscious mind watched like a stranger, looking at someone else's hands. November 12th. He forgot which war he had fought in. He knew there had been a war, a ship, and a lot of gray water. But the name, the dates, the enemy, and the reason were all gone. Only the water and the silence between explosions remained. This was what scared him more than forgetting. The losses didn't hurt. They felt like relief, like putting down a heavy bag that you'd been carrying for so long that you forgot it was heavy. Each memory that went away left behind a space and a quietness, as if his mind were a house being emptied room by room. Each room that was cleared out made the house bigger, calmer, and more open to whatever wanted to fill it. That was the trap, the emptiness felt like peace. And each night's signal filled the empty spaces with its tones, harmonics, and impossible chord. It fit perfectly, as if the pieces of Virgil that were being taken away were being replaced by pieces of something else, something older, something that didn't have a name because names were made by humans. And this thing existed before humans, like bedrock. He was becoming less Virgil and more valley, less man and more resonance. The change didn't feel like death. It felt like waking up. It was like the signal had been helping him take off a heavy, complicated costume his whole life, a name, a history, a personality, a set of memories. That was the seduction, not pain or fear, but freedom. The freedom of not being anyone at all. One night, Virgil turned off the radio, but the signal still came through. The radio was turned off, and the tubes were cold, but sound was coming from the speaker. He unplugged it and took off the speaker wire, but the sound kept coming from the walls, the concrete, the tin roof, and the hard-packed alkali ground below the building. The whole station was vibrating at the frequency of the signal. The building had turned into an antenna, and the signal had soaked into the materials like water soaks into a sponge. Virgil went outside, and the sound was everywhere. In the air, in the ground and the ridges on either side of the valley was humming. It wasn't the low background vibration Kus had described. It was the full signal, all 12 tones layered, dense and alive, pouring out of the sandstone walls of Dry Ridge Valley. It was like the earth was a speaker, the valley was a throat, and something deep below had finally found its voice. The alkali flats were as white as a frozen sea in the starlight, and the ridges rose on either side like the walls of a cathedral. Virgil could feel something pressing against his skin at wind pressure. It was the pressure of a sound that was so complex that it had become physical. It had crossed the line between vibration and substance, and was now something you could lean against, like how deep water holds a swimmer. He was standing in that sound, his boots on white alkali, and the sky was so clear that it looked like black. As Virgil looked up, he saw something that he would spend the rest of his life trying to forget. The stars were wrong. They weren't missing or rearranged, but they were in the wrong patterns and didn't belong to any constellations. There were tight clusters of blue-white points pulsing in time with the signal, as well as long, sweeping arcs of faint stars moving across the sky like the wake of something huge passing overhead. It looked like the sky belonged somewhere else. And in the middle, directly above the valley, there was a patch of sky that was darker than the rest. There was nothing but darkness around it, no clouds, no starsa void so big that looking at it felt like looking into the pupil of an eye that was looking back. The stars were moving slowly around the central void, pulled in by an acoustic gravity. They pulsed with the signal's frequencies. The sky was a receiver tuned to the same impossible band that had been resonating between these ridges since before anything with arms. Virgil stood there for a long time. He doesn't know how long. When he went back inside, the clock read 4:17 a.m. 4 hours had disappeared. They weren't blacked out, they were just gone. 4 hours had been replaced by a gap as clean and precise as the one where his mother's name had been. In the morning, he tried to write a report but couldn't remember the call sign for Cheyenne. He then tried to write his own name, got Virgil, and stopped. The rest wouldn't come. Over the next 3 days, he lost the rest. He lost the name of his father, the smell of rain, the idea of March, the ability to read a clock with his hands, and the feeling of hunger. Each loss felt like peace, which was the trap. The emptiness felt good. The signal filled what was taken with its own harmonics. He was becoming less human and more resonance, less Virgil and more frequency. On November 15th, Collis arrived at the station and found the door open. Inside, every dial was set to maximum, and the room was filled with static and hum. As Collis turned off the lights, he saw Virgil sitting on the ground outside, facing south, staring down the street. The writing in his logbook was so small and dense that it looked like it was solid. The entries started out normal, but they got worse over time. English entries turned into fragments, then symbols, and then wave patterns that were drawn over and over. On the last page, there was a single sentence that said, "I give it a name. It gives me a frequency. I am becoming the signal, and the signal is becoming me." Virgil said calmly, "I can't remember how to get home here. In fact, I know the word home and what it means, but the specific one that belongs to me isn't there anymore." Kiss didn't say anything for a long time. The valley in front of them was white, silent, and huge. "It's not malicious," Virgil said. "It doesn't know what malice is. It is just gathering. As the wind gathers dust, it sends it out into the world, and whatever comes back, it keeps. It records every sound, signal, and name that is spoken within range." Collis drove Virgil to Keir that afternoon on a 23-mile dirt road. The truck bounced over ruts and washboard gravel, and with each mile, the valley's ridges got smaller in the rearview mirror, sinking back into the flat Wyoming plain like something sinking into the ground. For the first 10 miles, Virgil sat in the passenger seat with his hands on his knees and his eyes open but focused on something inside him, not the road, the sky, or the brown plains rolling by. It was like he was taking stock of a house that had been broken into and counting what was left. At mile 11 he said, "Trosclair." "What?" Cola said, "My name is Trosclair, but I forgot it this morning." At mile 15 he remembered that it was his birthday, September 9th, 1902. The numbers came back first, then the. By mile 18 he remembered her name, O'Dall. Along with the name, he remembered her face, her hands, and the way she sang while she cooked. The weight of those memories felt like gravity, like pieces of himself falling back into place after being held in suspension. By the time they got to Keir, Virgil could explain most of himself, but not all of himself. There were gaps, small specific absences, the name O'Dall. Little things like his first-grade teacher's name, a song his dad used to sing on the porch after dinner, and the exact shade of green the shutters were on the house where he grew up. He lost them and only found them when he looked for them, like reaching into your pocket and finding a hole where something small had fallen through. He learned not to look. A doctor in Kemper checked him out and found nothing wrong. There was no fever, no neurological symptoms, and no physical explanation for what had happened. He suggested rest, fluids, and a transfer. Virgil agreed, and the Weather Bureau moved him to a station on the Gulf Coast of Florida. There was flat land, warm air, normal humidity, and wind that blew in straight lines instead of circles, traps, and building on itself into something alive. The ocean stretched to the horizon in every direction, and its sound the steady crash and pull of waves was honest. It didn't ask for anything and didn't take anything. It was. Over the course of months, Virgil slowly got better. The things he had lost came back to him in pieces, like objects revealed by low tide. His mother's name came back first, then the ship, and finally the war. Each memory came back without warning, just as if it had never been gone. He would be eating breakfast and remember the name of the street he grew up on. He would be brushing his teeth and remember what rain felt like all at once. He couldn't remember his father's voice or what his handwriting looked like before the valley. He couldn't remember what it was like to be cold, even though he had spent 2 Wyoming winters in a concrete box. The memory of being cold had been taken, and whatever the valley had put in its place had disappeared when he left, leaving nothing behind. He worked in Florida for a while. He was dependable, quiet, and good at his job. The kind of man who got there early, did what had to be done, and went home without complaining. Every night before he went to sleep, he touched every surface in his bedroom and whispered his name 3 times. I am Virgil Trosclair. I am here. I remember a ritual he did every night to make sure nothing had gotten through while he wasn't looking. He married a woman named Parthenia Boudreaux. In 1941, she was a librarian who had moved south because she needed to be somewhere warm for a while. She had her own silences and empty rooms. They saw something in each other that they never named, and their marriage was based on the idea that some questions are better left unanswered. Huet Fontenotte was 24 years old and fresh from training. He came in a government truck with a duffel bag and the confidence of someone who had never really been alone. No one told Hewitt why his predecessor was leaving. They just said it was a normal transfer, nothing special, and a good experience for a new operator. Hewitt was in charge for 5 weeks. At first, his transmissions were normal, clean, professional, and formatted correctly. For 3 weeks, they were standard weather reports. But then, in the 4th week, things started to change. Reports became irregular, shorter, missing data fields, and gave barometric readings that didn't match any weather system in the area. For days, wind speeds were listed as 0, which wasn't possible in the area. November 30th, a note that wasn't normal. Frequency interference on an unallocated band. Looking into it. December 1st, a signal that wouldn't go away, wasn't atmospheric, and responded to input. December 5th, there was no transmission. December 8th, his last transmission. A single sentence repeated 3 times. The frequency is not on the dial. The frequency is in the ground. The frequency is in me. 2 days later, a recovery team arrived at the station. Hewitt was gone. His things were still inside, with his duffel bag packed and his boots by the door. Huet Fonte wasn't there, even though the door was open and the bed was made. All of the equipment was on, and all of the phones were ringing full volume. The building was filled with a hum that gave people headaches and made it hard to find their way around within minutes. 2 team members had trouble remembering their addresses for days afterward, and one said he heard a faint tone in his left ear for 3 weeks. Huet Fonte's body was never found, and his logbook had something on the last page that was never included in any report. There was a list of names of dozens of people who had gone into the valley over the previous 100 years. Alcide was there. Next to each name was a frequency that could be measured to 4 decimal places. Each person who had gone into the valley had been given their own tone, their own note and a chord that had been building for longer than anyone could measure. The station was shut down in January 1939, and the equipment was taken away. The building was left to the valley, and within years, alkali dust had buried it. The antenna stood for another 10 years before the wind finally took it down. Virgil was moved to a station in Florida, where the air was flat, warm, and humid, so sound could travel normally, and the wind went where it pleased without going around. He slowly got better, piece by piece. The things he had lost came back, like his mother's name, his birth date, and the ship. But not all of them. There were small gaps, like the name of his first-grade teacher, A. He worked in Florida for 19 years and married Parthenia Boudreaux in 1941. She was a librarian who had moved south because she needed to be somewhere warm for a while. They had their own silences, and their marriage was based on the idea that some questions are better left unanswered. But Virgil kept a shortwave radio in the garage with vacuum tubes and a dial that covered every frequency. He bought it at a government surplus auction in 1943. When Parthenia asked him why, he said it was a hobby. She didn't believe him, but she didn't push either. The radio went into the garage and sat on a workbench under a canvas cover. It became a part of their life, like how you walk past a locked door every day and know what's behind it but don't open it. He never turned it on. Virgil would get out of bed, go to the garage, and stand next to the radio. He would never touch it or turn it on. He did this just once a year, like changing the bandage on a wound you don't want to look at. Sometimes late at night, when the house was quiet and the Gulf was calm, and the only sounds were the slow ticking of the kitchen clock and the breathing of a woman who trusted him enough to sleep next to him without knowing what he carried. He would stand in the dark in the warm Florida air that smelled like salt and jasmine, and nothing at all like alkali dust, and listen. Most nights, there was silence. The radio was cold and dead, just a box of metal, glass, and wire, as still as the concrete blocks of the station he'd left behind. But some nights he might have heard something very faintly. It could have been his imagination. It could have been the sound of his heart beating. It could have been the transformer on the power line. It might not have been anything at all. He could hear it through the canvas, the cold tubes and dead circuits, and a machine that had no power, no connection, and no reason to make any sound at all. It was a single, steady tone that went up and down every 90 seconds. The valley remembered him. The signal was waiting, as patient as stone, as patient as wind, and as patient as the slow geological patience of ridges that have been shaping sound since before anything with ears existed to hear it. He would listen to the radio for 47 heartbeats, and then cover it, go back to bed, lie next to Parthenia, whisper his name 3 times and wait for morning. For 23 years, that was enough. Virgil died of heart failure quickly in 1962. He was 60 years old. Parthenia found him in the garage, standing next to the radio with his hand on the warm canvas cover. She sold the radio at an estate sale, and a collector bought it. But here's what I want to leave you with. In 1997, a geology team from the University of Wyoming mapped subsurface formations in the area around Dry Ridge Valley. It was a standard seismic survey, and the work was paid for by a federal grant to study fault lines in the northern plains. They put geophones along both ridges and set off small charges to map the rock layers below. The data they got back was wrong, not just a little off. It was completely wrong. The seismic waves weren't behaving as they should have. The waves were traveling through the ground and reflecting off of rock layers in predictable ways. But the ridges were catching, holding, and cycling the waves back and forth between them at a frequency that didn't match any known geological formation. The ridges weren't just rock walls. They were resonators that shaped and amplified the energy that passed between them, like how the body of a guitar shapes the vibration of its strings. The team did the test 3 times and each time got the same result. The valley. While the ridges had been there for 65 million years, the signal was resonating in a way that wasn't random but rhythmic, at a frequency that showed structure, layers, and harmonics that built on each other in ways that were too complex to be natural and too consistent to be random. The signal had the mathematical signature of something designed, something intentional. But the pattern of those harmonics had been building up since before mammals existed. A 26-year-old woman named Mercer Kittredge stayed late in the lab one night to run the data through pattern recognition software. She was thorough in the way that people are thorough when they don't know what they're looking for yet. She found the main frequency, got rid of the background noise, and fed the clean signal into an algorithm that finds structured patterns in what looks like random data. The program immediately flagged it as having characteristics that match encoded information, not language. Structure, intention, and repeating motifs that changed over time and built on earlier versions showed the unmistakable fingerprint of something that wasn't just vibrating, but talking. And deep within that signal, below the main resonance, the software picked up something else. Voices that were weak, broken, and spread out across frequencies like broken glass, but clearly human. Dozens of them, maybe more. Names, words, and pieces of identity stuck in the. Mercer played the single signal through speakers only once. She heard a man's voice repeating what sounded like a name. She couldn't make out the word, but the sound was preserved in sound like insects are preserved in amber. Each one was at a specific frequency and was still sending out the last sounds it had made before the valley absorbed them completely. The voice was calm and patient, not upset. It sounded like someone who had been saying the same thing over and over again for a long time and couldn't stop. She turned off the speakers and sat in the lab for an hour without moving. Then she deleted the file, formatted the hard drive, and changed the topic of her thesis to groundwater mapping in the Bighorn Basin. When her advisor asked her why, she said she didn't want to talk about it because the sound had made her forget her middle name for 3 days. She said that when she closed her eyes, she could see a sky full of stars she didn't know, slowly rotating around a void that pulsed with sound. She also said that she could still hear it at night, when her apartment was very quiet. If you look at modern satellite images of Dry Ridge Valley, you'll notice something strange. The road that leads to the old station site shows up on some maps, but not others, as if it were there 1 minute and gone the next.
Do you think that some places can hold a sound forever? Do you think that a valley can learn your name just by listening to the wind carry it? Tell me in the comments. I read all of them. This was your fear. Turn down the volume tonight, and if you hear a tone you can't explain, change the frequency. Before it changes you, before it learns your name, before it adds your note to because the chord is still being built. After all these years, after all these voices being lost in the stone, the dust, and the dry, still air of a valley that remembers everything it has heard, it's still being built, and it's not done yet.